American airmen when they had shot down 5 enemy aircraft. And David Putnam, who was from Newton, Massachusetts, and gone to Newton High School and then had gone to Harvard, was America's ace of aces. He was the leader. He had shot down more enemy aircraft than anybody else in the war. And because of that, he was pretty famous back here in the United States. His exploits were chronicled in newspapers across the country, and there were articles about battles that he'd won and dramatic dogfights that had taken place that he'd come out victorious. And so he was kind of a star. He had gone over to Europe, gone to his mother at one point, shortly after the United States declared war, but before we'd actually deployed, and said, look, I got to do my part. Like so many young men through the centuries, you know, there's a war going on, and I'm itching to get involved. He took a cattle boat over to Europe because we were shipping live cattle over there to feed troops. I took a cattle boat, got himself a job in an ambulance corps, and then joined the Lafayette Escadrille, which was a unit of French planes with American pilots. And it was a way for Americans to sort of play a part in this war that was going on that America was not yet involved in. And because he was a great athlete, I think his hand-eye coordination lent itself well to being a pilot, and his aggressive nature as well. And he became just this fantastic pilot with seemingly no fear. On September 12th, the day that Yankee division was winning the Battle of St. Mihiel, he was in the air over the battle. World War I was the first war in which it became a three-dimensional war rather than a two-dimensional war. Up to that point in history, war was about you advancing and the other guys retreating, or you pushing them back and moving back and forth in 2 dimensions like a basketball game along a battlefield. World War I brings aircraft, and now suddenly it's a 3-dimensional war. And you could be up above, and you could be doing reconnaissance, and you know where the enemy is located, and you can drop bombs on them. You can shoot them from these airplanes. And so it totally changed warfare, which is part of what was capturing the imagination of the people back home in hearing about stories about David Putnam. But on that September 12th, his luck ran out. He took on 6 German planes at once and was shot twice through the heart and was dead before his plane even touched down on the ground. And he was 19 years old, which stunned me when I did the math and figured that out, but shouldn't have. You know, it is still true, I suppose it has always been true, that we send our young men off to fight wars. But I had read so much about David Putnam, and he had been so celebrated here in America, that when the light bulb did finally go on in my head and I realized he was just a teenager, it seemed so incongruous from all that he had accomplished.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Well, to tie in a lot of these different themes together, I'm wondering, with this convergence of all these things happening, World War I, America ramping up and getting involved in the war effort, and making that push that really gets over the tipping point where there's Allied victory on the horizon, with the effects on the World Series and leading into the golden age of sports, as you talked about, with one of the worst pandemics in history in total numbers, but just in terms of the percentage of the population. What would you say are the legacies of that convergence of all these different things happening together? And you see that what you argue that it's not just coincidence, but they're intertwined with each other. What are legacies that you see of this?
It's amazing what inflection points were taking place at that period of time. The ones we've talked about in terms of war and medical advances and sports, but in society in general. 1920 was the first U.S. census in which more people lived in and around cities than rural areas in America. So 1918 is right at that turning point. And part of that is driven by this war effort in which there are suddenly thousands of jobs available in factories in and around cities. And so people have an economic incentive to leave the farm and go get a job in one of these cities. It's also a driver of a sharp increase in immigration. Partly there are refugees from the war in Europe heading to America for greener pastures. Partly it is that we need a labor force. We've taken the critical mass of our labor force, men, and shipped them off to war, and somebody needs to replace them. And so immigration fills that gap. And it's evident, like so many other things in that month, in Massachusetts, where the elections that are held in the fall of 1918 result for the very first time in a Irish Democrat being elected to statewide office. There had been a generation after generation history of rock-solid Republican Yankee control of state government in Massachusetts. Calvin Coolidge came out of that tradition. And here was the first indication that Irish Catholic politicians in Boston were on the rise and were going to play a more and more critical role. And today we would say this is when Massachusetts turned blue and went from a red state to a blue state and stayed that way for the past 100 years. The other way that that vacuum for labor was filled was with women who found themselves in the workforce, not doing what had traditionally been quote-unquote female jobs, teachers, nurses, things of that nature, housekeepers, but were on the factory floor. They were building ships and weaving blankets and making shoes. As a result, were very caught up in the labor movement as well. And that sense of activism gave a renewed life to the women's suffrage movement. And one of those remarkable coincidences of timing and geography that I cover in the book is that Maud Wood Park, a woman from Boston who was the leading suffrage advocate in Boston, was convinced to go to Washington and lobby on behalf of a amendment to the Constitution that would give women the right to vote. And almost single-handedly, she drives the women's suffrage amendment to a critical vote in the U.S. Senate, where her number one opponent is Henry Cabot Lodge, her own home state senator from Massachusetts. Sorry. Lodge and his fellow Republican senator, John Weeks, are leading the anti-suffrage movement in the Senate. And suffrage, in what seems strange today, was not a partisan issue. There were lots of Democrats and lots of Republicans in favor of women voting. There were lots of Democrats and lots of Republicans against women voting. It was very idiosyncratic based on the personalities of the politicians themselves. So we have this rise of industrial life in America, a migration to cities, the increase of importance of labor unions and labor rights, and this debut of women both as a labor force and a political force. And all of them have their roots in the fall of 1918 and in very specific ways in Massachusetts in September of 1918. And those issues still ring through our lives today.
Right. Well, a lot of events that simultaneously strike America at the same time. The book is September 1918, War Plague and the World Series. So, Skip, thanks for sharing all these things with us. If people want to find you online, is there a website or Twitter or a best place to find you?
Yep, the book can be purchased at any of the online book sites or at your local bookstore, or you can get more information about the book at september1918.com, or follow me on Twitter at Skip Desjardin.
Will do. Put that in the show notes so people can follow up. Skip, thank you for joining us.
I really appreciate it. I had a great time. Thanks.
All right, well, that was the episode for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. First of all, I'd like to thank the Knowlton's Rangers, and especially our spy masters, Baron Fraser, Carl from Norway, Chris from Maine, and Melissa Sarnowski, and I'll explain what that means in a second. If you want to support the show and help me keep producing this content, there are 4 easy ways for you to do it. 1. Subscribe to the show and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. If you want to do that, you can go to historyunplugpodcast.com and there you'll find instructions. 2. Join our Facebook group, which you can find if you just search for History Unplugged. And please like and share posts that I put up about new episodes. 3. Submit a question to me so that I can answer it on air. You can email me at info@historyonthenet.com or leave a voicemail. And again, go to historyunpluggedpodcast.com and you'll find instructions. Lastly, and I think this one is the best, is to become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. The Knowlton's Rangers were an elite reconnaissance and espionage detachment of the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the History Unplugged membership program. Learn how to join by going to patreon.com/unplugged. So here's what you get if you become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. If you join at the level of Scout, you can get early access to new podcast episodes, along with enjoying absolutely every single episode of the History Unplugged podcast ad-free. All 270 and counting episodes. If you join at the level of Intelligence Officer, you can also get access to premium episodes, like a multi-part series on the life of Audie Murphy, the most decorated combat soldier in World War II, or the 10-part series Ottoman Lives, a series that looks at the cast of characters that made up the Ottoman Empire, such as the Sultan, the eunuch, the harem servant girl, and the soldier. And finally, if you join at the level of Spy Master, you get all the same stuff as the scouts and intelligence officers, but you also get a shout-out to you and or your business at the end of each episode, a 3-pack of hardcover history books, plus you'll be put at the very front of the line for me to answer your question about history, and I can guarantee I will dedicate an episode that's about an hour long or so to your question. Sign up at patreon.com/unplugged. Again, that's patreon.com/unplugged. Anyway, those are the ways you can help out the show. Thank you so much for your support. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get your daily dose of all things history related, from ancient Greece to the Cold War. We'll see you next time at the History Unplugged podcast.